Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Bedford, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this, our fourth webinar in the Zurich Municipal Risk Series in collaboration with Zurich Resilience Solutions. Today, we're talking about climate and resilient places. So many of you will have heard me talk about the climate change challenge for a number of years now. And whenever we talk about the Global Risk Report, whenever we talk about risk, sort of evolving and emerging risks, climate looms large. Today, we're talking about places because often the conversation around climate really focuses on physical infrastructure, but the impacts on people and communities have the potential to be huge, and we're already starting to see a lot of that coming through. So really pleased today that we've got speakers from Zurich Resilience Solutions who can talk about the physical, but also bring in that people and communities impact as well. This session is being recorded and you will be sent a link to the recording afterwards. Our faces will be taken off. You'll just have the slides and the narrative. That link's held and you can share it with any of your colleagues who you wish to, or watch back if you want to recap on what is covered today. We would love it if you would ask questions. We will save questions until the end, but as we go through, if something pops into your mind, please do pop it in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will come to it. I'll pose it to our presenters after they've gone through the majority of their presentation. So today, from Zurich Resilience Solutions, we're joined by Nicoline, who I will hand over to in a second, from our climate resilience team, and by David Hounsell, who is a senior liability risk consultant. So they're both got tons of experience and heard them both speak before, so it will be a really engaging and informative session. So that's enough from me. I will hand over to Nick to start taking us through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. So we've got a rough agenda for today, but like Alex said, we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. But yeah, do pop some questions in the chat. If there's something that we can answer during the session, we can. But just sort of to put a little bit of context behind what we'll talk about. So just to get us awake and thinking, we've got a very short quiz at the start, just looking at the UK climate risks. We'll then go into how are climate change hazards already impacting the UK and what we're likely to see kind of in the next 10, 20 years. And then myself and David will run through a few case studies. So these are the risk to people, but also, as Alex mentioned, communities across the globe, and sort of what we can take away from those case studies and how cities are already adapting to climate change. We'll then touch a little bit on how Zurich Resilience Solutions can support organisations, so that cities, universities, schools, adapt to climate change. And then we'll finish off just talking a little bit about financing adaptation. I know it's a question that lots of people have when we talk about this topic. But just to start off with, to make sure everyone's awake, we'll head over to the quiz. So there'll be a poll in the chat that Sarah should pop up. So there's 3 questions. So yeah, if you can read through those and then submit your answers. So yeah, the first question is, how many properties in the UK are currently at risk from flooding? So that's from rivers, the sea, and the surface water. And then second question, yeah, that should be the first question up on the screen. And then the second question will be about storms. So in the 2023-2024 storm season, this is particularly poignant in the UK. It was the first time in Western Europe that we reached which letter in the storm season. So was it Kathleen, Henk, or Lillian? And then the third question should also pop up on your screen. So what percentage of UK homes will be at risk of overheating worldwide if worldwide temperatures rise above 2 degrees? This is likely to happen by 2050. So what percentage of homes will be at risk of overheating by 2050? So I'll give you a little bit of time just to submit your answers, but that's all the questions that we'll be talking about. Yeah, I can see some answers coming in already, which is really good. looking through the answers, it seems like most people have got those correct. Okay. All right, so just to run through that. So actually, for question 1, in terms of the number of properties that are currently at risk of flooding, seems like most people have got that correct. So that's, option B. So that's 6.3 million homes across the UK are currently at risk of flooding. But just to make the point, it's not just homes that are at risk of flooding in the UK. We're seeing that 38% of roads and 37% of rail are also at risk of flooding. So it's not just property or businesses, it's also the infrastructure and energy grid across the UK. But it looks like most people got that right with 56%. And then moving on to the question on storm, which letter in the alphabet did we get to in last year's storm season? Again, looks like most people got that correct with Storm Lillian. So not sure if most people can remember, but this was the August storm, so August bank holiday. You might have seen it was when Reading Festival was open and it was the Friday night, everything was closed. So we do see a large increase in storms in the winter season, but these also happen in the summer as well. And then looking at the last question, what percentage of homes were at risk of overheating? So it's actually 90%. So it's 90% of homes across the UK will be at risk of overheating by 2050. So it looks like most people put 52%. But yeah, this is a statistic that sort of shocks most people. The UK has a really old housing population compared to other European countries. And this is what really increases our risk of overheating in UK homes. We just haven't adapted to climate hazards like other European countries. So lack of insulation, really thin windows, that's kind of the main reason why we're overheating in the UK. But good to see everyone's responded. Just to sort of put that into context, we'll move over to what are the impacts to the UK. So this graph, the Met Office put together, and it really pulls out kind of the key hazards that are impacting the UK. So you can see at the bottom, present day, this is what we're experiencing today. So about 30 days per year, we experience kind of really hot weather in the UK, about 50 days cold, and about 8 days of really heavy rainfall. And as we see, I said earlier, so by 2050, if we're going along the current trajectory, we should see 2 degrees of warming. So if we look at the kind of the orangey colour, we can see that there's about a double in the amount of days per year that we're likely to experience really hot conditions. We'll see a decrease in cold weather, but we'll also see an increase in that kind of heavy rainfall and also drought conditions across the UK. But just sort of to take away from this, it's really the increase in the amount of heat days per year, the amount of heavy rainfall and drought conditions. This will see the biggest impact across the UK. But kind of what does this mean across the UK? So we're just pulling out some key impacts for each of those hazards. So heat is the one that we talk about a lot, obviously, when it gets warm, but we're probably the most vulnerable to. So flooding is a topic that we talk a lot about year on, and we do a lot on kind of adaptation to flooding. We can understand exactly what's at risk from flooding based on flood data, historic events, but heat is seen as kind of the invisible hazard, where it's actually really to do with the vulnerability to people that causes that increase in the impact. But David will touch upon that on the next section. But it's really that impact on people to do with heat. So that's vulnerable individuals, young people, elderly people, chronic illness. We'll also see an increase in disruption to transport. So that's delayed services, reduced services across the UK. A huge increase in the energy demand. So as we try and cool our buildings, a lot of UK infrastructure, particularly the business sector, rely a lot on kind of air conditioning. So we'll see a huge spike in the energy demand based on that. Because of cold weather, we'll actually see a decrease in energy demand in the kind of winter months, decreased disruption to transport and decreased risk to health. But then just moving on to the heavy rainfall, we'll see a huge increase, especially to do with heavy rainfall in cities. So this is from our kind of urban drainage systems not being able to kind of hold the amount of water that's projected to fall in any one period. Big disruption to transport. So we've seen that a lot in the UK, especially on the train networks. When there's periods of heavy rainfall and storm, we see huge disruptions to our train network and also the infrastructure. Just from the statistics shared earlier, there's a big increase in the number of properties that are at risk of not just flooding from rivers, but particularly from increased rainfall in cities. But sort of what we're talking about today, when we talk about climate change, a lot of the kind of past space has been speaking about mitigation, which is really, really important. And what this means is reducing emissions globally. So this is what kind of global emissions mitigation is called. So reducing the amount of emissions we emit and hoping to reduce global temperatures going forward. The topic for today is actually on climate adaptation. So it's really good to keep going with climate mitigation. But what we're really trying to focus on is actually living in cities, communities, organizations that are adapting to climate change. So climate hazards are likely to impact everyone in the UK through heat, flood, and drought. And it's how do we live with these climate hazards? So that can be from a range of different angles. So that could be from flood protection, building sustainable buildings, reinforcing transport networks, and also water management, just to name a few. So those are sort of the physical impacts of climate hazards, but I'll hand over to Dave, who will talk about the impact to people.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. So climate change impacts human health directly and indirectly, and it's strongly influenced by a country's environmental, social and public health capabilities. And some of these things might sort of conjure up images that we see on televisions of disasters in the developing world. But it's very much felt in the UK and other developed countries. If we just think about the last few months, we'll have seen the wildfires out in America, in California, as well as flooding in Spain. In the UK, 2020 saw a heat wave that had excess deaths of around 2,500 people. And Public Health England warned that number of heat-related deaths could triple by 2050. That's the point where we hit that 2-degree rise in average temperatures. And we know that excess heat-related mortality is first detectable just at around 24.5 degrees. So for some people, that might seem like quite a pleasant day, but for those more vulnerable populations that Nick just mentioned, we start to see a really significant impact. And a couple of definitions that we will use throughout. A heat wave is 3 or more days where the temperature threshold is above either 25 or 28 degrees, depending on where you live in the UK. Dangerously hot weather is 30 degrees or more on average for 5 days during the summer. And health warnings tend to be issued at 28 degrees. And human thermal comfort is determined by a number of factors, including the air temperature, which tend to be what we'd talk about, but also metabolic rates, so how hard we're working, and humidity. And a change in any one of those will impact our physical and mental comfort and health. But this also gives us a clue as to how we can both assess the risks and decide on how to mitigate those negative measures. So BBC had an interesting experiment where one of their reporters was subject to a number of tests where their body temperature was raised from 21 degrees, sorry, not the body temperature there, the environmental temperature was raised from 21 to 40 degrees over 1 hour, and various measurements were taken of the person's response, both mentally and physically. So their core temperature rose 1.3 degrees Celsius just in 1 hour. They lost 400 milliliters of sweat. Their breathing rate increased by 50% and their heart rate by 61%. They weren't actually doing any physical exercise. This is purely in response to the increased temperature. Blood flow to their brain decreased by 8.5%, and their memory puzzle score fell from 23 out of 30 to 17 out of 30. So you imagine what, this, as well as sort of feeling uncomfortable, what this is actually doing for our cognitive abilities and how we might go about our work or our daily lives. In France, in the heatwave of August 2003, the high number of deaths of elderly residents in its urban centres were attributed to a lack of mobility, along with pre-existing medical conditions. Housing characteristics associated with the fatalities were a lack of thermal insulation, and particularly if people were sleeping on the top floor in the hottest part of older buildings. High temperature around the building generally was also a major risk factor, as was a failure by residents to adapt to the changing heat and adopt protective behaviours that other people might do. And just in case, we're giving the impression it's all doom and gloom because it's an insurance presentation, it's worth bearing in mind there are positive health outcomes that might be associated with this as well. Warmer, dry weather might get us out of our cars and reduce nitrogen dioxide air pollution, just as it did over COVID. And we may have the opportunity for more physical exercise and social interaction, both which help both mental and physical health. But what might this mean for the industry, the insurance industry, and your insurance policies? If we go to the next slide, please. So this quote is from the Chief Risk Officers Forum. At the very at the top there, a number of bullet points, and I think it's just as relevant to individual organisations. So you guys, our insured customers, as it is to society as a whole. So there's lots of ways of looking at the impact of climate change for our risks, but we focus, we've called this focusing on places, and we'll often refer to urban centres, and that's primarily because that's where 83% of the UK population live, not necessarily cities, which tend to be the focus of these things, but just urban places, small towns as well. When we look at these things, if you go down the list, so Nick and I, we work for Zurich Resilient Solutions. So that second one, provide risk management advice and adaptation solutions. So that's very much, what Zurich are looking to expand into, as well as the traditional insurance solutions that we've always provided. If we look at flood events, for example, climate risk modelling for the UK indicates we can expect this to be more frequent and more severe. The impact on property damage and business interruption coverage and claims tend to be fairly obvious. The cost of property damage is often used as a measure for how severe a particular climate event or weather event might be. So the storms in Spain this past winter have been estimated at 4 billion euros. But there's other impacts. If we think about employers' liability policies, if you have employees that are responding to a flood situation. So recently a telecommunications company has been fined 1.34 million after an engineer died while trying to repair a phone line. The engineers have been working both near and in a river over the past 2 months. At the time of the incident, there'd been flooding to the area, which meant the river was much higher, flowing much faster. Attempting to cross the remaining section of the river, the engineer slipped into a deeper part and the force of the river swept them away. Investigation found there was no safe system of work in place for work on or near water. The engineer had received no training, information or instruction around safe working. There might be an impact on public liability policies where customers or patients or service users are harmed through a poor response to a flood or a heat event. The availability of mental health support from policy providers to those affected by flooding is one of the key things that we've noticed at Zurich, is the amount that the phone helplines are used for just about how people are feeling and responding to it from a mental health point of view, as well as the physical damage that they are having to deal with. We think about the impact on public liability or environmental impairment liability policies if the flood causes pollution impacting third-party property or health. There might be D&O coverage issues where senior managers fail to take adequate action to mitigate the consequences of climate on their organisation, or potentially to mitigate carbon emissions. And there's also the extent for legal fees coverage for criminal prosecutions following an incident where people are severely injured or even killed. And we could make the same sort of projection for the impact of heat. Radiant and air temperature increases. As we've mentioned, our bodies respond in different ways, and we need to see if we can't reduce our metabolic rate through rest, or wear clothing that helps heat transfer, or increase the speed of the air that's cooler than our skin through ventilation and air conditioning, then we could potentially have a problem. And we also need to think about the effect of heat on our psychology and behaviour. A nationwide analysis in Japan between 2012 and 2015 found that ambulance transports due to assault increased linearly with the rise in daily temperatures. So in addition to these direct impacts of climate change, I thought it would be interesting to compare Zurich's liability and motor claims experience before, during and after specific heat waves to help us understand the secondary impact on human behaviour and performance. I'd like to briefly share the findings of that study with you today. So the first one shows general liability. So we took 3 heatwave events, 2018, 2020 and 2022, and compared the heatwave time periods with liability and motor claims using the date of loss to find out if there was a correlation. This is what we found. So the blue bars represent the maximum daily temperature. The dark blue line, it tends to move around quite a lot, is the number of claims with the date of loss on that day. And the blue bar is coloured pink, where the number of claims is above the 90th percentile. So that means the number of claims is higher than 90% of all other daily claims, suggesting a strong correlation between temperature and an incident resulting in a claim, either for injury or third-party property damage. Now, we don't know whether this is a direct, as I said, a direct impact, or whether it's a more typical one. So somebody's driving the car and something has happened that's caused an accident. So we don't know exact reasons because the data doesn't allow us to. This is really just to see whether there was a correlation. So on the general liability, the public liability side of things, we could see the 90th percentile of instances towards the end of the heat wave. In most cases, in the last 2, which were 2018, there's a big spike on the day after the heat wave. So although it missed the actual official dates of the heat wave, it does sort of show that spike. If we go on to the employer's liability data, we see something slightly different here. There is in the first one, there is the correlation towards the end of the heat wave for the first 2. But interestingly, the second chart that you see there, on this date, the heat wave affected the north of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland and Northern Wales. And you see a much more even spread of claims throughout the heatwave period. And I'm wondering whether this is something to do with the ability to acclimatise. So, we tend to be used to different types of heat in different parts of the country. If we look at motor claims, I think the results are even more clear. And most of you have heard, the idea that most claims are due to some sort of human error. So we know heat affects our behaviour. Our personal experience tells us that. But it also seems to increase the risk of making a mistake, an error of judgment, or possibly even ignoring safety practices. So for this aspect of climate change, we need to consider not just the direct losses that may associate with the heat or flood or anything else, but in this case heat, but also the indirect ones, and factor that into our risk assessments, our safe systems, and our worker training. This is an important new insight. It doesn't necessarily mean or need new or encourage new adaptations. The actions that you take to reduce the direct impact of heat might also reduce the risk from these secondary impacts. It does, however, provide an additional reason why action on climate adaptation is so important. And with that, I'll pass back to Nick, who's going to run through some examples of adaptations in our next sections.
Thank you, David. So we've spoken a lot about the impacts, so the physical impacts and the impacts to people. But just sort of on a lighter note, there's a lot that cities, organisations are already doing to adapt to climate change. So we're just talking about a few examples. We're hoping that through these case studies, you can take away a few examples. So just to start off with, I'll be talking about Rotterdam. So not surprising, flood impact. So they've had a really proactive approach to tackling flood risk across the city. As you can see the image, as you can see on the screen, this is the Marsland flood barrier, and it's one of the largest storm surge barriers in the world, and it's movable. So it still allows ships to come in, and then during high storm surge, they can close that barrier. A lot of what's spoken about historically when it comes to climate adaptation are these physical barriers, so flood barriers, kind of how buildings are designed. But this isn't the only approach that you can take to climate hazards. So the city kind of took a three-step approach. So yes, it's protecting your buildings, so stopping floodwaters coming in, but it's also becoming a sponge city. So our urban areas, there's a lot of tarmac, kind of hard surfaces which don't absorb any water. And there's been a lot of research into the sponginess of cities. So how much water can a city absorb rather than just put straight through its drainage system? So Rotterdam was a really good example of living with water. So when they do experience kind of high levels of rainwater, where is that water going? So one example was they created a huge 1 kilometre levee, but part of that was having a green roof. So in that huge kind of surface area, that absorbs additional surface water. But also one of the examples is the kind of water park. So the image that you can see there it's a basketball field when it's not experiencing heavy rainfall, but then during periods where there is heavy rainfall, it becomes sort of a storage tank for water. So it's the approach that Rotterdam took was, we'll protect water, we'll protect the city from water coming in, but also we need to make sure that we can hold on to water so it doesn't kind of flood those really high risk areas. And kind of the third approach to flooding was using resilient materials. So when we talk about adaptation, it's kind of the physical engineering of stopping water coming in, but also having our areas that are resilient to flood water. So if it does flood, it's easy to clean up, it doesn't cause excessive damage. And then so it's sort of the flood happens on a Friday and you'll be back up and running hopefully by the next day or Monday. So it's a really high turnaround living with these climate hazards day to day. And one last bit of kind of architectural design that Rotterdam undertook was actually incorporating floating homes. So knowing that sea levels were rising, they built homes on water on stilts, so they rose and dropped with the level of the water. So these are quite innovative solutions. Not every city can incorporate these, but these are just a few ideas that some cities have taken. Some of them are quite radical, but they're working really effectively across Rotterdam. Then our second case study is in Boston. So Boston is experiencing really, really severe heat during the summer months. And one of the statistics that I pulled out, they've experienced the same amount of heat waves in the last 10 years as they did in the previous 50 years. So it's really a hazard that's impacting the whole of Boston. But one thing to pull out from this case study is kind of, it's a hazard, as I mentioned previously, that it impacts people very differently. And one of the kind of parts of the research was identifying vulnerable communities. And one of them was to do with the kind of income distribution across Boston. So it became very evident, as you can see on the map on the left, the red areas are kind of those heat spots through Boston, and these correlate directly with kind of lower income districts. And the map on the right shows kind of a heat network. So during heatwave events, where are my areas that I can cool off? So their approach to kind of adapting to heat was not as doing as many heavy engineering projects as the flood work, but actually identifying those communities that could be at risk of heat. So yeah, this image just shows the huge difference between neighborhoods. So one neighborhood could be experiencing 34 degrees temperature, and then a neighborhood next door could be experiencing temperatures of 40 degrees during the same event. And it's to do with kind of what are the buildings made of, how much vegetation is there in an area, are there water features in the area? So Boston mapped out kind of what are the buildings, where is the vegetation, where's our water network, identifying where are the communities that have the highest vulnerability to heat. And so sort of create a kind of heat framework. They put together a various amounts of kind of adaptation solutions. So this was creating cooler communities, but also having an active response when there is a heat event. What do communities do to become more resilient? So that's having kind of a heat monitoring system. So during periods of heat, sort of warning neighborhoods before that event happens. So a couple of days before the heat wave events happens, do you know where you can go during a heat wave event? So creating kind of cool spots. So this could be like public libraries, urban areas with shading, in sort of parks and kind of water spaces, and also just identifying in the community where are the people that you need to look out for. So particularly the elderly community and the young. And in terms of sort of cooling communities, it was looking at the transport network and buildings across Boston to try and, if you're commuting across a city, having cooler buses, so buses with air conditioning, trains with air conditioning, to try and cool down not just people's homes and where they live or where they work, but also getting across the city itself. And they created lots of different heat resilience solutions and sort of ranked them between how much is that heat being reduced, what's relief, what's the impact to public health, economic and environmental benefits. So it was a very community-led approach of working with people to identify who's at risk of heat and what can they do in that local area. So one other case study that our team at Zurich Resilient Solutions worked with was working with Madrid City. So this is a project we did a few years ago, and we worked with the city to identify, again, vulnerable people. As it's a very large city, we focused on schools. So looking at the network of schools across Madrid, where are the highest vulnerabilities to heat? So pulling out districts that had, increased chronic illness, lower income districts, and districts and schools that had a reduced amount of outdoor space to heat. So there's a direct correlation between schools that have outdoor areas that are just concrete, there's no vegetation, and the increase in vulnerability to heat. So the first steps, the 3-phased approach that we use in Zurich Resilient Solutions is this image that you can see in the middle, which pulls out the hazard, exposure, and controls. And one thing we say as a team is, when you're looking at climate adaptation, you really need to understand the vulnerabilities, the exposures. So we knew Madrid across the city is seeing increased temperatures, but it's really that vulnerability aspect of the city that can pull out, where do we undertake adaptation measures? So when we're looking at budgets within cities, businesses, communities, the most effective adaptation you can do is targeting exactly where those vulnerabilities are in the city. So those lower income districts, areas with a lack of outdoor space. So when you put forward an adaptation strategies, you're really doing it in the most effective areas. Just to talk a little bit more about how our team at Zurich Resilient Solutions has helped clients, I'll just hand back over to David to talk about the people aspect.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so one thing we sort of looked at, starting a few years ago now, was to sort of see the correlation between what we would predict climate change to do, and how that related to our lines of business and how we could better support our customers. So we looked at areas impacted by climate change. We work with existing customers, mainly on the insured risk, but we also look at our customers we don't necessarily have a current insurance relationship with, to look at their climate resilience. And some of the key areas are within our Zurich municipal customers, simply because of the scope, the sort of communities that they work with, the assets, the infrastructure that they work with. Personally, I do quite a lot of work with ZM customers on highways, which is one area where we're seeing a lot of sort of direct impact with climate change, and also around supply chain. And a lot of these risks, they won't exist in isolation. So hopefully we've already sort of outlined a little bit today. If there's a property risk, then there's quite likely to be a people risk as well. If there's a flood, somebody has to respond to it. Somebody has to clean it up. If you're putting in a new housing estate, or somebody's putting in a new housing estate, then that's going to tie into the highways network at some point. So what's the impact going to be in terms of runoff and the capacity of the highways drainage system to be able to cope with it? Who's going to take responsibility for sustainable urban drainage systems that tend to be put in now with any new builds, whether they're commercial or domestic? So from a liability perspective, we can support you and customers identifying at-risk workers and third parties, the communities that you work with, in assessing exposures and the adaptation strategies that you might adopt, as you can see from the slide there. So one, a fairly sort of simple example that we can give for our joined up approach is doing a review of a specific building's flood protection and resilience, combined with the review of the health and safety implications for employees and any contractors, subcontractors that are working for you as first responders or as part of the cleanup operations, to assess the sort of work that they're going to get in. And sometimes we do find that's, because it's, it's out of the ordinary, it's a non-routine job, it does sometimes get a little bit forgotten about.
Thanks, David. Just talk a little bit about how our climate team have helped customers. So the 3 kind of bullet points to the right link to the kind of hazard, vulnerability and controls. So when we're looking at climate hazards and how they impact organizations, a lot of effort is put on identifying what those climate hazards are. I think sometimes too much effort. It's really good to understand exactly what what the hazards are impacting. But the best thing you can do is be really proactive in your strategy to sort of implement adaptation and reduce the risk to those climate hazards. So it's really good to identify what those hazards are and make sure you know which key areas are at risk. But the best thing you can do is within your organization, pull together resources and stakeholders that can help kind of respond to those climate hazards. So identify those vulnerable areas and then make sure you implement adaptation solutions that are beneficial and actually will be kind of maintained year on and year on. So just one of the solutions I want to pull out today are response planning. So this is what we found in our team has been really beneficial for kind of organizations such as housing organizations. This can also be universities, schools and cities. So the kind of point of a hazard response plan is knowing exactly when to act, what you need to do and who is responsible. We found that in organizations, there's always business continuity plans, but they sit in a cupboard and no one really reacts to them. There are quite good flood response plans, but sort of the move forward is incorporating multiple climate hazards into your response plan. So when I say when to act, it's making sure that there are triggers. So when a threshold of a certain temperature is reached, you know what needs to be implemented. Do we need to kind of put up shading outside? Do we need to use more air conditioning during that time period? Do we need to encourage people to work from home? Or is working from home maybe not the most responsible solution? They might be more at risk working from home. So that kind of when to act is really, really important, and trying to make sure you know what to do before the event happens, because when the event happens, it's normally a little bit too late. A key aspect of that is also knowing exactly what to do. Like I said, having clear actions to say this needs to be implemented and where that needs to be implemented, and also who is responsible. Knowing within an organization exactly who is undertaking those tasks. So we say in our team, these are live documents. These should be looked at not just at the end of the year, but re-reviewed, updated when an event happens, what worked well, what didn't work well. So they can be the most beneficial solution when a hazard does occur. So I've just pulled out 3 aspects to kind of hazard response planning. And the first one that we've done with organizations and teams is this response planning workshop. So we found actually in very large organizations, sometimes there's lots of different teams that do really great work, but they don't communicate to each other. So this can be a lot to do with actually housing, that there's, the strategic view of what you do, and then there's people that work on the site. We found that people at site level, so these can be building managers, they do a lot that people don't realize. So if they know that flooding is likely to happen in an area, they're usually already undertaking adaptation solutions. So they might be using flood barriers, they might be moving kind of critical infrastructure goods to higher elevation areas. And what the response workshop tries to pull out is within an organization, knowing exactly what people are doing already and understanding the resources that you already have to your hands. A lot of the time we see that, lots of organizations are doing really good work already, but not working as a whole strategic organization together. So when you're also reporting on adaptation, there might be things that you're already doing that you can report on, but you're just not calling it adaptation solutions. So that could be kind of flood management, heat management. That's all sits under the umbrella of adaptation. And just to pull out 2 more sort of how to target response planning is, it's really good to do it at a strategic level first, so across a whole organization. And that kind of utilizes early response systems. So do you have a network of response systems or early warning systems that people at a very high level can sort of ongoing monitor and know exactly when they need to share that information at site level? And sort of that kind of operational site level response plan are those individual sites or teams that are on the ground and they know exactly what to do and when to do it. So this could be, as the image says, putting up shading, encouraging kind of, if you're in school, kids in school, to maybe not play outside, it's too hot. So having a really clear, distinct view on what do you do at strategic level, when does that knowledge need to be shared down, and what do you do at an individual level? And it's really good to break out kind of those different approaches. Just to finish off the slides, I'll move on to financing adaptation. So this is a question we're seeing more often and more often, especially in the public sector. So just to pull out, this is a really busy image, but just to sort of pull out the key stats, the red on the left is the private sector. So this is finance coming from the public sector, so the private sector, and in the blue is all the kind of finance coming from the public sector. And you can see in the top right, where the red circle, this is the amount of finance going into adaptation. And it's very, very little compared to the financing going into the mitigation. And you can sort of see the bulk of that finance is coming from the public sector. So sort of the kind of main takeaway from this is not enough funding is going into adaptation, and it's all coming from the public sector. And so where is that going? And very little of it is going into buildings and kind of infrastructure globally. This statistic is slightly out of date, so there is more efforts going into adaptation, but you can see a lot of the efforts have been put into mitigation, but a lot more needs to go into adaptation. And kind of the key stat that I think most people can take away from this is if you invest £1 into adaptation, you will save £8 later down the line. And it's that real, when you're talking about climate adaptation within your organization, it's not just the responsibility of the sustainability team, it's everybody in your organization. It will benefit all parts of your business. So when you're talking to kind of who's financing CEOs, it's going to impact every part of your business, and it's beneficial to everyone. It reduces interruption, it reduces damage, it reduces the amount of, if we're talking about schools, the amount of days of school days that are missed. So it has a benefit to all areas of communities to invest in adaptation. And just to sort of leave you with some resources, a lot of there's a lack of funding in adaptation, but these are a few examples where you can use to sort of start off with climate adaptation, and they vary in sizes. So across the UK, there's UK funds available, but there's also a lot of local grants available. If you're looking in your local area, there's one near me. I think the airport has a trust, and they can sponsor projects. A lot of those are to do with biodiversity project, but increasing green space will also help with adaptation. We also encourage collaboration with other cities and other municipalities. So C40 is a really good starting point. So the case study on Rotterdam actually came from C40. And it's a network of cities globally that are responding to climate hazards and putting forward case studies of what are we doing, kind of lessons learned, how can we help each other. And there's also now a push, especially in the UK, on this public and private sector engagement. So the Attenuate project is trying to put together public and private sectors. There's a mutual benefit to undertaking climate adaptation, so making sure that there's funding coming from both sides. In terms of frameworks, so we've put forward sort of our hazard vulnerability control methodology, and this is a very common approach across the organisation. So Climax is also a really good framework for you to use. So if you're not sure where to start when it comes to climate adaptation, there's a lot of good resources of start with your hazard, look at your vulnerabilities, and then implement your adaptation solutions. But I'll leave it there. I can see we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, David. So we've had one question in, but just to remind people, please do post any questions you have in the chat, and we will come to as many as we can of them in the next 15 minutes. Anything we don't have time for, we can always follow up on afterwards. I'm just going to do a little bit of reflection back at you, because as always, I've learned a lot on this webinar, and it might prompt questions, or I might come back to it in a moment. Right near the beginning, the 24.5 degree point at which you start to see a significant impact on humans, that is not excessive, and there also is quite a big gap then between that and that 28 degrees at which we start to see heat warnings. So for people looking at operations, anyone who works with vulnerable people, what's happening in that time frame, in that gap? Are we doing enough before the heat warnings come in? The vulnerability mapping, not everyone experiences things equally. There are various factors of vulnerability that make mitigation of climate hazards more targeted and therefore more efficient. So the example from Boston on that was really interesting. And then this point about kind of what I took from it was that climate response plans. They're kind of a bit of business continuity, a bit of emergency response plans, a bit of operational plans. Have we got them in the right place, and are they resourced in the right way? I'm not sure from conversations I've had with customers that they are. So yeah, just some areas that really stood out for me. So we're getting questions coming in. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start with the first one, which is what you talked about right at the end there, Nick, about climate financing and the return on investment, which I agree is a conversation that comes out a lot. The 1 to 8, there's various ratios, but the £1 invested, the £8 saved, any indication of time frame for return on investment? I know that when people are kind of bidding for funding, when they're asking for funding, even within their own organisations, being able to have an informed conversation about when return on investment might come and what it looks like is really key.
I know it's a really good question. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you the exact year that would kind of, you'd see the value in savings, but I am just looking through the paper to try and find that stat. So I'll put it in the chat, the full paper where that's been referenced. Oh,
brilliant. Thank you. So look for that coming in. And we will, I think, Nick, if we attach it to the follow-up email as well. Next one, again, about statistics to do with the heatwave data, which I believe you spoke to, David. Did Zurich normalise the data for an increase in activity? Drivers on the road, out and about generally in warmer weather. Funnily enough, I think we had a conversation about this just before we went live on this webinar. But yeah, normalising for increase in activity due to heat.
Yeah, really interesting question. It's very interesting. I was quite surprised myself. You know how much of a correlation there was. I mean, there's a lot of academic studies around the impact of heat on the human body and psychological impact, but I was surprised just how strongly this supported it. But no, we haven't. Some of our data, so we used standard UK European climate data, but the claims data are our own, but it's not particularly refined at the moment. Something that we are working on in part, in response to this. I mean, so there are some simple things we could perhaps do with this just to work out whether those particular dates were on a Saturday or a Sunday, where you might expect it was, the context of this whole conversation is really, around, work-related occupational issues, business and what have you. So that would be an interesting thing to work out. But of course, a lot of work, goes on at weekends regardless. And if it's, if heat is causing a problem to a degree, if there's more people out in response, then it's maybe something for us to be even more conscious of. The exposure is greater if more people are going out and enjoying the sunshine. So we could apply this to other things such as, say, a big event. We've just had the London Marathon, for example, and we know, if you've got something of that magnitude going on and you suddenly get a heat wave coinciding with that, and it was a lot hotter yesterday than it was, around this time of year, then you might have a problem. So really at this stage it's just to kind of flag, that there are these secondary impacts as well. But it's a good point. There's a bit more to do on it to really refine it and get more meaning out of it.
Thank you. So the next two questions we've got is more focused at underwriting, which I know Nick and David, you may want to come in, but I will give a stab at an answer on those because it more sits on the Zurich Municipal side than the Zurich Resilience Solutions side. Absolutely, resilience and sustainability and adaptation going beyond flood risk alone is, hopefully you've heard that come through a lot today. And I dug it. So one, it's not just flood risk. That is still the most significant climate hazard that we are considering in the UK. But actually, the more and more the conversations around heat as the other significant hazard. We also have windstorm when you're thinking about insurable perils. But yeah, flood and increasingly heat. And not just beyond flood risk alone, but to beyond property risk, as we've said. So a lot of attention is paid to how physical infrastructure responds to extreme weather, particularly on the flood side, not so much on the heat side. That's again, hopefully we've started the conversation about that today. But this impact on people and communities, so it's not a matter of just reinstating the building back. It's actually, there are significant impacts felt in terms of people's resilience then to future events, to bouncing back from the event that's just happened, et cetera, on the health side. So in terms of what insurers are doing, one, working hard to work with our partners on the risk side around understanding these risks better, getting the data, looking globally, because the extremes in a lot of these cases are being felt more in other parts of the globe. So why not learn from what they've done, even if not quite experiencing it at that levels here. So working to understand the risk better, what the best mitigations could be and how our propositions need to evolve, absolutely. Not just policy wordings, but also our wider proposition. So on the flood side, for example, at Zurich now, if people suffer a flood, they get access to support services, so counselling, etc., because actually the mental health impacts of suffering a flood event, the data is quite stark. I think it's 1 in 6, if not 1 in 9, somewhere in that region. So we've adapted our proposition. So hopefully that answers that question to some extent. And then, hi Ruth, thanks for your question. If the information isn't available, so as with everything these days, data and evidence is key. So how are organisations considering climate risk? How do we consider their climate risks? Sort of bringing the two conversations together in advance of any kind of pricing tender conversations. It is the most helpful thing to do, so that we can work together to get information, to get a risk view on what's being presented on the resilience side of properties, etc. Is the best thing we can do at the moment. Do we revert to worst case? We revert to modelling. We have our own modelling that informs pricing decisions. So yeah, as I say, I think in these cases where perhaps property resilience information, if it's not where it should be, let's work together on getting that shared understanding of what the risk might be early. Nick and David, I appreciate I've just spoken for a bit there. Is there anything you wanted to add on either of those points?
Not from my side. I think that was really well summarised.
No, good summary, Alex.
Build back better. Yeah, great question. How are insurers helping customers to build back better rather than replacing like for like? Again, I could answer that. I see you've just put yourself back on mute, David. Do either of you want to pick that up, or should I take that one?
I'll leave that with you. But just say we also support in our team with sort of kind of greenfield developments of what to incorporate when it comes to adaptation if you're building something new or rebuilding something after a flood loss.
Yeah. Okay. So in our case, so on the Zurich Municipal book, so our major loss claims teams and our claims teams do work on build back better principles. So what we would want to do is work with loss adjusters on not like for like, if that just means that the risk is going to reoccur, on how we can build back better without providing betterment. So not everything has to cost a lot of money, just the sorts of coverings that are put back in. If you've had a flood event, the sorts of flood coverings that are put back in, where electrical installations are, which way round the kind of boards go, whether they're vertical or whether they're horizontal, depends on how much has to be removed in the event of a flood. Build back better, both in terms of if there's any mitigations that can be put in to restrict the event happening again in the same way in the future, but also oftentimes it's about restricting the impact so that people can get back up and running more quickly. So we do work on Build Back Better principles, and as I say, we've got other parts of our proposition that support that. Just picking up on Nick's point actually about design. So there's the event of a claim, but also I know a lot of you will be doing renovation projects, regeneration projects, retrofitting projects. So building resilience by design into those is also something that we're really encouraging. And please come and talk to us if you're about to undertake sort of a big construction or development project about the design and how we can design in climate resilience, as well as often we're seeing a lot of retrofitting, for example, for that mitigation. Can we build in climate resilience as well at the same time, so that mitigation investment isn't lost somewhere down the line? And I just want to flag available on our website is a flood guide, which talks to that a bit, and a building resilience guide, which talks about how to build in a resilient way. I can't see, so no other questions coming in at the moment. We've got 4 minutes to go. If anyone wants to try and sneak in a last question while I'm summing up. We, as I say, we've recorded this. It will be shared. You'll get an email, follow-up email with a link to the recording. Please feel free to share that with whoever within your organisations you might want to. David and Nick, their details on the screen there, should you want to pick up on any particular issues or follow up with them on any of the support that their teams can offer customers or people operating in the public sector on these issues. I think Nick and David, is there anything you wanted to say before we wrap up and finish?
No, I think it was really well summarised. Just thanks everyone for joining and getting involved in the questions earlier.
I'm going to stop you, David. So we've had one. Oh gosh. The answer to the question that's just come in about trying to do anything to tackle rising global temperatures in terms of investment strategies or underwriting strategies. Yes, so you haven't put about operational strategies. So I think we've got net zero targets. Zurich globally have, and we've got a transition plan globally and within the UK about how we're going to get there. Investment strategies, yes, they're included in that, and our underwriting strategies. So we are engaging with high emitting customers to work with them on how what we have on our side, how we can help them transition down to a less carbon impactful way of operating. So absolutely the insurance industry is doing it. We have a sustainability report. Again, it's available on our website, which will go into more detail on that and on those things. So yeah, rather than, I could do a whole webinar on what we're doing, but rather than do that, as I say, there is information on the website, and feel free to come back with us with any questions on that. So right, I'm going to wrap up there, I think. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, David. And yeah, hopefully you found this interesting. The next webinar in the risk series is going to be on safeguarding. So look out for an invitation for that coming out, which is going to be held at some point in May, late May, similar time in May. So hopefully see lots of you there for that one. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy this nice sunny week it looks like we're going to have. And thank you very much for joining.